The ghost of last night's fire still lingered in the air, a faint bitterness beneath the rising perfume of yeast and golden crust. Lin Fen moved through the pre-dawn gloom of her bakery, a place that felt more like a cage with each passing day. The air, thick with the Texan summer heat that seeped through the clapboard walls, clung to her grey prairie dress, making the coarse fabric an unwelcome second skin. Her hands, dusted white with flour, worked the dough for the last batch with an economy of motion born from years of practice and a bone-deep weariness. Every knead, every fold was a prayer and a curse. This was her father's legacy, the heavy oak table, the cavernous brick oven, and the mountain of debt that came with them. A notice, tacked cruelly to the front door, served as a constant reminder: 7 days. 7 days to pay the bank, or the legacy would be auctioned off to the lowest bidder. Hope was a currency she could no longer afford. She slid the final loaves into the oven's fiery mouth, the metal door groaning in protest. The scent that filled the small room was a cruel paradox, the smell of comfort and home in a place where she had neither. It was the smell of her childhood, of her father humming a tune from a land he'd never see again as he taught her how to read the dough, to feel its life beneath her palms. Now, it was only the smell of her failure. She leaned against the cooling rack, the wire mesh pressing a faint pattern into her cheek, and watched the first fragile fingers of light stretch across the dusty main street. Soon the town would wake, and the few customers she had would trickle in for a loaf, their pennies and dimes a pitifully small dam against the flood of her debt. It would not be enough. It was never enough. A wave of despair, so potent it made her dizzy, washed over her. Her long black hair, usually tied in a neat bun, had come loose, strands clinging to her damp neck. She felt a phantom weight on her shoulders, the silent judgment of her ancestors, of a father who had poured his soul into this very floor. He had believed in the promise of this new land, in the simple honesty of a good loaf of bread. Lin Fen believed only in the stark reality of the ledger book sitting on the counter, its columns a testament to her struggle. The sun was rising, painting the world in hues of rose and gold, but all she could see was the encroaching darkness. A shadow fell across the doorway just as she was pulling the last of the bread from the oven. She didn't look up, assuming it was the baker's boy from the next town over, coming to mock her dwindling stock. But the silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the cooling loaves. When she finally turned, a man stood there, framed by the dawn. He was tall and broad, but it was the stillness about him that she noticed first. He wore the dust of the trail like a second coat, his hat low over his eyes, his boots scuffed and worn. He looked like a man who spent more time with cattle than with people, his face weathered by sun and wind into a mask of quiet solitude. He seemed to take in the entire room in a single, sweeping glance, the neat rows of bread on the racks, the faint sheen of flour on every surface, the exhaustion etched onto her face. Lin Fen straightened, her defensiveness a shield she drew around herself. She had dealt with men like him before, men who saw her as a curiosity, a Chinese woman alone in a man's world. Her voice, when she spoke, was brittle. "We are not open yet." He didn't move, his gaze settling on the bounty of bread. The air was thick with its warm, nutty aroma, a scent so wholesome it felt out of place amidst her turmoil. He finally pushed his hat back, revealing a face that was surprisingly gentle for all its ruggedness. His eyes were a clear, steady brown, and they held no judgment, only a quiet assessment. "I can smell it from the end of the street," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing, unused to conversation. He took a step inside, his presence seeming to shrink the small shop. He gestured with a gloved hand towards the racks. "This is all of it for the morning." Lin Fen nodded, her throat tight. "Yes. This is it." She braced herself for him to haggle, to complain about the price, to walk away with a single loaf. It was the familiar, soul-crushing dance of her daily existence. The man looked from the bread to her, then back again. He seemed to be calculating something, though she couldn't imagine what. Then he did something that completely unmoored her. "I'll take it," he said. All of it. She stared at him, certain she had misheard. "All of it," she repeated, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. "The whole batch." He gave a short, simple nod. The whole batch. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch, the sound of coins clinking together unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He began to lay them on the counter, large silver dollars that shone in the growing light. The sheer amount of money made her stomach clench. It was more than she often made in a week. Suspicion, cold and sharp, pierced through her shock. No one bought this much bread. It was a joke, or a trick. Why? She asked, her voice sharp. He paused in his counting, looking up at her. His gaze was direct, unwavering. My men need to eat, he said simply, as if it were the most obvious reason in the world. And this looks like good bread. The weight of the coins in her hand was solid, real. It was an anchor in the swirling sea of her panic. After the dusty rancher had gone, leaving with his arms full of burlap sacks laden with her entire morning's work, Lin Fen had stood frozen behind the counter for a long time. She counted the money 3 times, the metallic scent of the silver clinging to her fingers. It was enough. It was enough to appease the banker for another month, to push the shadow of foreclosure back from her door. It wasn't a solution, merely a reprieve, but it felt like the first full breath she had taken in years. A cautious, fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl in her chest, so unfamiliar it was almost painful. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, cleaning the bakery with a renewed energy, the motions no longer feeling like a prelude to defeat. Yet, a part of her remained wary. The man's sudden appearance and his extravagant purchase felt like a dream, a strange fluke of fortune that would not be repeated. He had said his men needed to eat, but she knew the ranches in this area. They had their own cooks, their own supplies. Why come to her? The week that followed was a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. The notice on the door was gone, the banker's smug face replaced with a grudging nod of acceptance. But as the days passed, Lin Fen found herself watching the road at dawn, her heart giving a small, foolish leap every time a horse and rider appeared in the distance. She told herself she was simply hoping for another large sale, a practical and sensible desire. But it was more than that. She was looking for him, for the quiet man with the steady eyes. She baked with a nervous energy, making more than usual, just in case. On the 7th morning, she was convinced he would not come. The sun was higher than it had been, the air already promising a sweltering day. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, settled in her stomach. It was foolish to have hoped. Then, she saw him. He rode at the same unhurried pace, dismounting and tying his horse to the post with the same efficient movements. He stepped into the bakery, bringing with him the scent of dust and leather. "Good morning," he said, his voice just as quiet as she remembered. "Morning," she replied, her own voice betraying a hint of the relief she felt. He looked at the racks, laden once more. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Looks like you were expecting me." A blush crept up her neck. "I made my usual amount," she said, a little too quickly. He nodded, seemingly accepting her lie. He placed the same amount of money on the counter as before. "Same again, if you please," he said. "And I'll be back next week. Same day, same time." If that's agreeable to you, it was more than agreeable. It was a lifeline. A standing order. The words echoed in her mind. This wasn't a fluke. It was a plan. "That is all agreeable," she managed, her voice steadier this time. As she packed the loaves, her fingers brushed against his. His hand was rough, calloused, but there was a warmth to it that startled her. It was a simple, accidental touch, over in an instant, but it sent a strange flutter through her. He left as quietly as he had arrived, and Lin Fen watched him go, the silver coins cool on her counter, a new, more complicated warmth blooming in her chest. The weekly visits from the rancher, whose name she learned was Arthur Vance, became the new rhythm of her life. Every Tuesday at dawn, his lone figure would appear at the end of the street, a predictable and comforting sight. The transaction itself remained brief and professional, but the silence between them began to change. It was no longer the awkward silence of strangers, but a more companionable quiet, filled with unspoken understanding. Lin Fen found herself noticing small details about him. The way he always removed his hat the moment he stepped inside, a gesture of respect that few men in this town afforded her. the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, which seemed to soften when he took in the sight of the fresh bread. She noticed the careful way he handled the loaves, as if he understood the work that went into them. One morning, as she was bagging his order, he broke their usual silence. "My father was a farmer," he said, his gaze on her flour-dusted hands. "He always said you could tell the quality of a person's character by the quality of their bread." Lin Fen paused, surprised by the personal admission. "My father was a baker," she found herself replying, the words coming out before she could stop them. "He said bread was honest. It cannot lie. It is either good, or it is not." Arthur nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. "He sounds like a wise man." He looked directly at her then, his brown eyes sincere. "This is very good bread." The simple compliment landed in her heart with surprising force. No one had ever said that to her. Customers bought her bread, they paid for it, but they never commented on its quality, on the craft itself. They saw only the transaction. Arthur saw the honesty in it. From that day on, their conversations began to tentatively expand. He would ask about her supply of flour or comment on the summer heat. She, in turn, would ask about his ranch, about the cattle. She learned he owned the sprawling lands to the north, a vast and lonely enterprise he'd inherited. He spoke of it not with pride, but with a sense of immense, solitary responsibility. He never pried into her personal affairs, never asked about the debt or why she was alone, but she felt he understood anyway. There was a perceptiveness in his quiet gaze that saw more than she revealed. She began to look forward to Tuesdays not just for the security the sale brought, but for the visit itself. The few minutes he spent in her shop were an oasis of calm and respect in her otherwise strenuous week. She started setting aside a particular loaf for him, one she knew was perfectly browned, with the best crust. It was a small, secret gesture, a silent acknowledgement of the budding friendship that was slowly, carefully, rising between them, as warm and as promising as the dough on her proving board. As July bled into the oppressive, shimmering heat of August, the nature of Arthur's visits continued its slow, inexorable shift. The parched earth cracked under a relentless sun, and the air in the bakery was often stifling, even at dawn. One Tuesday, as Lin Fen was wiping a sheen of sweat from her brow, Arthur lingered after the transaction was complete. He held the heavy sacks of bread but made no move to leave. "It's a hot one today," he stated, his gaze gentle on her flushed face. "You should have some water before you ride out," she offered, surprising herself with the suggestion. It was a simple courtesy, but it felt like crossing a threshold. "I wouldn't want to impose," he demurred, though his eyes showed his gratitude. "It is no imposition." "Please," she gestured to the small, rickety chair in the corner, the one her father used to sit in. She poured him a dipper of cool water from the well bucket, the sound of it splashing into the tin cup a welcome noise in the heat. He drank it down in one long swallow, then set the cup on the counter. "Thank you, Miss Lin," he said, his voice raspy from the dust and the drink. He still did not leave. Instead, he leaned against the counter, his presence solid and calming. The heat is hard on the cattle. The creek's running low. It was an invitation, she realized. A sharing of a burden. "The yeast suffers in this heat, too," she replied, offering a piece of her own world in return. "It makes the dough lazy. I have to wake it up." He smiled at that, a genuine, warm smile that transformed his weathered face. "Wake it up." With a little more warmth, a little more care, she explained, finding it easy to talk to him about her craft. "My father taught me. He used to say the dough has a spirit. You have to listen to what it needs." She spoke of her father freely for the first time, not just as a baker, but as a teacher, a dreamer. She told Arthur how her father had carried his own sourdough starter all the way from his home province, a living piece of his past. As she spoke, she saw a new depth of understanding in Arthur's eyes. He wasn't just a customer, he was a witness to her history, to the legacy she was fighting so desperately to protect. The next week, he did not wait for an invitation. He brought the bread to the counter and then moved to the chair himself. Lin Fen had a cup of weak tea waiting for him. They sat in the quiet of the morning, the aroma of baked goods mingling with the faint, clean scent of the tea. He told her about a coyote that had been troubling his chickens, and she told him about a batch of rye that had refused to rise. They were small stories, tales from two different lives, yet they began to weave together in the small, flower-dusted space, creating a delicate tapestry of shared solitude. The bakery was no longer just a place of business, it was becoming a sanctuary. The unspoken arrangement between them had become the anchor of her week, a source of stability that went far beyond the financial. She no longer felt the gnawing dread in the pit of her stomach as she baked, instead, there was a quiet hum of anticipation. She began to see the world beyond her oven door with new eyes. The color of the sunrise, the sound of the crickets fading as the town awoke, these were things she now associated with Arthur's arrival. The line between business and friendship had blurred into non-existence, and a new, more fragile line was beginning to be drawn. One Tuesday, he arrived with something extra in his hand. It was a small, squat glass jar filled with a rich, amber liquid. He set it on the counter next to the stack of silver dollars. "This is for you," he said, his usual stoicism tinged with a hint of uncertainty. Lin Fen looked at the jar. Inside, a perfect honeycomb was suspended in the golden honey. "I have a few hives on the far side of my property," he explained, as if sensing her unspoken question. "The bees have been busy with the late summer wildflowers. I thought it might be good with your bread." The gesture was so simple, so thoughtful, it stole her breath. It was a gift from his world to hers, a product of his land meant for the product of her hands. It was the most personal thing he could have offered. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice soft. It was the first time she had used his given name, and it felt both momentous and perfectly natural. He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw the same recognition. "You're welcome." Lin Fen, hearing him say her name, the two syllables spoken with a gentle reverence, sent a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the heat of the oven. The transaction was complete, the bread was bagged, but he lingered, his hands resting on the counter. The air between them was charged with a new energy. The pretense of their original arrangement was gone, replaced by a raw and sincere connection. He cleared his throat. "I was wondering," he began, his voice a little rougher than usual. "The church is having a town picnic on Sunday. I know you work most days, but I was wondering if you might consider going with me." It was not a demand, or an expectation. It was a question, humbly offered. He was asking to bring her out of the shadows of her bakery and into the light of the town, to stand beside her not as a customer, but as a companion. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. To be seen, truly seen, with him. For the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to want something more than just survival. She wanted a Sunday picnic. She wanted to walk beside this quiet, honorable man. "I would like that very much," she said, and the smile he gave her in return was brighter than any sunrise. The hinge on the oven door chose the worst possible moment to fail. It happened on a Monday afternoon, a day before Arthur's scheduled visit, with a sickening groan of stressed metal followed by a loud crack. The heavy iron door sagged, hanging askew and refusing to close, rendering the oven completely useless. A cold wave of panic washed over Lin Fen. Without the oven, there was no bread. No bread meant no sale to Arthur, a loss of income she still couldn't afford. More than that, it felt like a personal failure, a betrayal of the trust and routine they had so carefully built. She spent an hour trying to fix it herself, her hands growing slick with grease and her frustration mounting with every failed attempt. The metal was warped, the pin sheared clean off. It was a repair that required a blacksmith's skill and tools she did not possess. By the time dusk fell, she sank onto a flour sack, defeated, the useless oven looming like a tomb in the twilight. Tears of pure exhaustion and despair welled in her eyes. She had come so far, had allowed that fragile bloom of hope to take root, only for it to be crushed by a simple piece of broken iron. When Arthur arrived at dawn the next morning, he found not the welcoming aroma of fresh bread, but the cold, stale air of failure. Lin Fen stood by the counter, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides. "There is no bread today," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The oven, it is broken." He took in the scene at a glance, the cold oven, the despair in her eyes, the faint tear tracks on her flour-dusted cheeks. He didn't offer empty words of sympathy. He walked past her, his boots loud on the wooden floor, and crouched to examine the broken hinge. He ran his calloused fingers over the sheared metal, his expression thoughtful. "The blacksmith, Mr. Davies, is a fair man," he said, more to himself than to her. He stood up and looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "This can be fixed." He turned and left the bakery without another word. Lin Fen watched him go, a fresh wave of hopelessness washing over her. She thought he was leaving for good, that the broken routine was the end of it. But less than an hour later, he returned, and with him was the town's burly blacksmith, carrying a heavy tool bag. Arthur simply stood back, a quiet, reassuring presence, as Davies went to work. He paid the blacksmith from his own pocket before the man even had a chance to state his price. "Consider it an advance on the next few weeks," Arthur said, cutting off her immediate protest. But they both knew it was not an advance. It was a gesture of profound care. That evening, after the oven was fixed and glowing with renewed life, Arthur stayed long after the sun had set. As he finally prepared to leave, he reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "Lin Fen," he said, his voice low and serious. "Your troubles don't have to be yours alone." The broken oven marked the final turning point. After that day, Arthur's presence in her life was no longer confined to the brief moments before dawn. He began to visit in the afternoons, after she had closed the shop for the day. He would help her sweep the floors or stack firewood for the oven, his quiet companionship transforming menial chores into moments of shared peace. Their conversations deepened, moving from the practicalities of ranching and baking to the landscape of their pasts. He told her about his parents, who had traveled from Ohio with dreams of raising cattle, and how he had been running the ranch alone since his father passed a decade prior. His loneliness was a vast, unspoken thing, a quiet echo of her own. In turn, she spoke more of her life in this country, of the sting of prejudice and the constant struggle to be seen as more than just an outsider. With him, she felt not just seen, but understood. They took to walking by the creek in the evenings, the setting sun casting long shadows across the dusty plains. It was during one of these walks, with the sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus, that he stopped and turned to face her. "My house is too quiet," he said, his words simple but heavy with meaning. "It's a good, strong house, but it's empty. It needs life. It needs the smell of your bread in it." He looked down at their hands, which had somehow found their way together. "And I need you, Lin Fen. Not just on Tuesday mornings. Every morning. Every evening." It wasn't a flowery, poetic proposal. It was something far better. It was honest and true, a statement of fact from a man who dealt in realities. He was not asking her to be a rancher's wife in the traditional sense, to abandon her own life for his. He was asking for a partnership. He respected her craft, her independence, the legacy she had fought to protect. He wanted to add his strength to hers, to build something new together without erasing what she had built on her own. "My bakery," she said, the words a soft question. "The bakery is yours," he answered without hesitation. "It's part of you. We can hire a girl from town to help you. We can make it bigger. Whatever you want." "I just don't want to face another sunrise alone." Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in her memory, they were tears of overwhelming joy. This quiet, steadfast man was offering her not an escape, but a home. A partnership of equals. A shared future. She had started her journey in this town fighting for survival, but he was offering her a life. She squeezed his hand, her answer in the simple, radiant smile that spread across her face. "Yes, Arthur," she whispered. "Yes." Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the town's small courthouse with the justice of the peace and 2 witnesses plucked from the general store. The town watched, as towns always do. Some whispered behind their hands, surprised by the unlikely pairing of the solitary rancher and the quiet Chinese baker. But many others, who had seen Arthur's dusty horse tied outside the bakery week after week, simply nodded in quiet approval. They had witnessed the slow, steady courtship and recognized its sincerity. Life on the ranch was a world away from the confined solitude of her bakery. The sheer scale of the sky, the endless sweep of the grasslands, the profound silence broken only by the wind and the lowing of cattle, it was overwhelming at first. But Arthur was her anchor. He guided her through this new life with the same patient gentleness he had shown from their very first meeting. He taught her the names of the wildflowers that grew near the creek and showed her how to read the clouds for signs of rain. In return, she brought life into his big, empty house. The aroma of her baking soon filled every room, a constant, comforting presence that chased away the ghosts of his loneliness. She did not give up the bakery. True to his word, they hired a bright young woman named Clara to help, and Lin Fen found she enjoyed teaching her craft as much as her father had. She would ride into town 3 days a week, her wagon laden with bread that was now more popular than ever. The rest of her time was spent with Arthur, building their shared life. The years began to pass in a blur of seasons. Summers were for hard work, haying, mending fences, and canning vegetables from the garden she had planted behind the house. Winters were for quiet contentment, spent reading by the fire as storms raged outside. Their partnership flourished. Her practical sense balanced his quiet deliberation. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, and he learned the delicate science of her sourdough starter, which now lived in a clay pot on their kitchen hearth. Soon, the sound of children's laughter filled the ranch house, first a boy with his father's steady eyes, and then a girl with her mother's deft hands. They grew up between two worlds, equally at home on the back of a horse and in the flour-dusted warmth of the bakery. Lin Fen and Arthur watched them grow, their own love deepening into a powerful, unspoken bond, a comfortable, unshakable thing forged in shared sunrises, common purpose, and quiet respect. Decades melted away like snow in the spring. The world outside their ranch changed in ways they could hardly imagine, the arrival of motorcars, the stringing of telephone wires across the plains, but on the land, the core rhythms of life remained the same. Lin Fen's long black hair became a river of silver, which she still wore in a neat braid down her back. Arthur's broad shoulders were stooped with age, but his hands, though wrinkled and spotted, were still strong. The bakery in town was now run by their daughter, Sarah, who had inherited her mother's passion and her grandfather's legacy. People came from 2 counties over for Fen's bread, a name that now stood for 3 generations of quality and care. One late summer evening, Lin Fen and Arthur sat together on the wide porch swing he had built for her on their 5th anniversary. The wood was worn smooth from years of use, a silent testament to thousands of shared sunsets. The air was cool, carrying the scent of cut hay and the rich smell of the earth settling for the night. Arthur reached over and took her hand, his gnarled fingers intertwining with hers. It was a familiar, comforting weight. They sat in a companionable silence, watching as the setting sun painted the vast Texas sky in brilliant strokes of orange, pink, and purple. The sprawling ranch before them, once a symbol of his solitude, was now the heart of their family, a thriving testament to a lifetime of shared work. Sarah sent a letter, Lin Fen said softly, her voice a little thinner than it once was. The new oven she ordered has arrived. It's one of those modern gas ones. She says it heats in a fraction of the time. Arthur chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. Your father wouldn't have known what to make of that. He'd have said it has no soul. He would have, she agreed, a fond smile gracing her lips. But he would have been proud of her. He would have been proud of all of this. They fell silent again, the only sound the gentle creak of the swing. He looked at her, his brown eyes, now webbed with fine lines, still full of the same sincere warmth that had struck her all those years ago in the pre-dawn gloom of her bakery. It was good bread, he said, his voice filled with a lifetime of memories. It was a simple statement, but it held everything, the desperation of that first morning, the hope his extravagant purchase had sparked, the foundation upon which they had built their entire world. She leaned her head against his sturdy shoulder, a gesture as natural as breathing. The weight of his presence was the same as it had always been, solid, reassuring, and true. She looked out at the land, at the house filled with their history, at the fading light on the horizon, her heart full of a profound and quiet gratitude. It was a good life, she replied.